Ted, let's begin this discussion by focusing on your book.
Good.
Why did you write this book? Why should we buy this book?
I think this book is aimed at many audiences. I first note in the dedication page that I have 6 grandchildren, and I want them to know what their grandfather tried to do for their world and generation. Second, I like to think that this book tells the American story, which David McCullough, the great historian, said needs to be told because we forget about it. So the book, once we get into the history, talks about my grandparents who came on a boat from Denmark. On my father's side, grandparents who came on a boat from first Ukraine and then made their way to Liverpool. On my mother's side, none of those grandparents could speak a word of English. None of them had any money at all. My father was born in a sod house on the prairie in Nebraska. In fact, my father was also in politics, and when he was running for his second term as Attorney General, my mother devised the very catchy slogan, "From sod house to state house." My regret was that he died before Kennedy was elected, because given my office a few doors down from the Oval Office, someone might have remarked from sod house to state house to White House in one generation. So that is the American story.
Ted, now your public life, your political life is, of course, enormous interest. Let's explore this a little further, what you've been talking about. Why should we read about your family in Nebraska in the 30s and 40s?
This book actually began when a well-known American historian, whose book was discussed with me and Bill Moyers on this stage a year ago, if I have my dates right, was in my office to show me a transcript, because he was in charge of the Kennedy tapes at the University of Virginia, Miller Center on the Presidency. And this transcript showed that Kennedy had mused aloud about moving me into Mac Bundy's office as National Security Advisor if Mac Bundy was sent to the State Department. And this historian, Tim Naftali, ironically he's now head of the Nixon Library, Tim said to me, the history community knows all about John Kennedy and how he changed the world, our country, the Democratic Party, the liberal movement, and we know something about how you influenced Kennedy, but we don't know anything about you. Where did your ideas and ideals and talents come from? And that's what the first part of the book is about.
And what made you decide to leave Lincoln, Nebraska? You were pretty well fixed there. Your family was known. You had a comfortable future. And go to Washington in 1951, where you were totally unknown.
Well, let me first stress that we didn't consider ourselves well fixed.
Well, you would have been well fixed in the future.
Maybe. We were very middle class. My father had his own practice of law. When I graduated, he no doubt expected that I would join him in that office, but it was his practice, it was not mine. And in law school, I had been increasingly interested in what's called public law, administrative law, regulatory law, international law. And there wasn't much of that in Lincoln, Nebraska. And 2 visiting lawyers from Washington passing through town had noted that I was first in my class and head of the editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and said when I graduate I should look them up and maybe join their firms in Washington, which sounded very interesting to me. And when I never heard further from them, I one day made up my mind and got on the train. I had never flown. Got on the train in Lincoln and went to Washington to look for a job.
In 1953, you began working with Kennedy. Now, you were totally opposite individuals. He was a rich man, graduated from Harvard, he had traveled abroad, great family and social connections. He was a Catholic, he was fun-loving. Your background was quite different. They don't necessarily go together, but your background was quite different. How did you bond with Kennedy?
First of all, I'm going to make it clear, I loved fun.
Not in the way that Kennedy did.
But most of what you're talking about, wealth, religion, war record, father's conservative views, those aren't the characteristics that really decide how a person will work and be compatible with another on public policy. I think Kennedy felt that my liberalism was something that would be a useful, different point of view that he should be exposed to, and that my idealism would fit in with his. So in many ways, in terms of our respective commitment to public service, our interest in making this a better country and a better world, we weren't so totally different.
Ted, you when you were first associated with Kennedy, that is several years before he became nationally known, did he have the ambition to be a national leader? Did he feel he was a man of destiny? Did his father push him? What motivated him?
Well, those are all very good questions, Ralph. He did not talk about the presidency. In fact, I can see in my mind's eye the moment during that first year or so. He was in his seat on the Senate floor, and I came up and told him that the farm bill, then being, though I'm from a farm state, I really didn't know much about farm agriculture policy. But I did know enough to know that Massachusetts farmers and consumers would not be helped and might even be hurt by the farm policy that was about to be voted on the floor, even though it was strongly supported by the National Democratic Party and consistent with Roosevelt's New Deal for farmers. So I said to him, from the point of view of Massachusetts' economy, you probably should oppose this, but if you have ambitions for a high national office in the future, you'd better. And he just shook his head and he said, no, if I start thinking like that, I'll be no good around here.
His father, a very important influence, was quite conservative, and in his early political years, Jack Kennedy was also somewhat conservative. How did he move away from these conservative ideas to become what is today a kind of liberal icon?
Carefully. Gradually. I think Kennedy was interested in my views. He wanted me to insert my views into the drafts I prepared for him, and increasingly, as he became more of a national figure, those views became more consistent with the progressive ideals of the Democratic Party, and that became even more so in 1960 when he became a candidate, when he was exposed to peoples at the bottom of the economic ladder, when he was exposed to the views and pressures that came from civil rights groups, from labor unions, from other progressive elements in the party, and that was consistent with what I was writing. So I think I say in the book that he started out at his father's house and had to travel a bit of a distance to where we met. I started out from my father's house, and my father was an outspoken progressive, and it traveled also, but Kennedy was somewhat influenced by my idealism, I like to think. I was somewhat influenced by his pragmatism. Both of us saw the need to make certain his views were consistent with the views of the Democratic Party and the country as a whole. So we both traveled a distance from our respective fathers' homes and philosophies, and somewhere in the middle we formed the philosophy that I like to quote him when he said, "I think of myself as an idealist without illusions."
Did his father object to some of his liberalism?
All I know is that the first time I met his father, I still remember walking in the back door of the home in Hyannisport. He was sitting there reading. He looked up and he said, "You must be Sorensen. You can write for Jack, but you're too liberal for me."
Now, at the start of Kennedy's presidency, he did not seem intensely interested in civil rights. What changed him?
The real world changed him. Civil rights became more of an issue in 1961, 62, 63. Interestingly enough, and I can't remember whether I make this point in the book or not, interestingly enough, I've been told that Kennedy's inaugural address, although it gave only a few words to domestic civil rights, his address inspired movements of all kinds by young people, by minority peoples, by those who wanted to champion civil rights, environmental rights, consumer rights, women's rights, because the torch had been passed to a new generation of Americans. And they began, those activists, with activities that created problems for the new administration, such as the so-called freedom rides, which were bitterly resented by Southern governors, sheriffs, and others. And they put pressure on Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, to try to stop them, which he wouldn't do, and on John F. Kennedy as president to try to stop them, which he wouldn't do. But the movement grew until there were protests and demonstrations throughout the country, and particularly throughout the South. And the Southern reaction was sheriffs with dogs and fire hoses, the jailing of Martin Luther King and a good many others, and increasingly it became what Kennedy, when he made his great speech on the subject in June 1963, said was essentially a moral issue. And he recognized as president that he had to respond. He had no choice, even though he also recognized that politically it would inflict an almost fatal blow on the Democratic Party, and that
in the South,
especially in the South and border states. And since the Kennedy-Johnson Civil Rights Program was enacted, the Democrats have only elected 3 senators from the South and no one else.
Now, you begin your book with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is kind of gateway to your story.
Well, one part of it, because in terms of my own role, because I was told to begin a book with what moment in one's life is the most pressure, most vivid, and I've never forgotten very much of those 13 days, which our mutual friend, Arthur Schlesinger, called the 13 most dangerous days in the history of mankind.
Arthur Schlesinger.
But there's also a later chapter in the book about the missile crisis because I think it was Kennedy's finest moment and reflected all the elements of Kennedy's approach to foreign policy, a commitment to peace, a willingness to negotiate, a desire to communicate, and so on. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but go ahead. I do begin with the missile crisis.
Arthur Schlesinger says it's the most dangerous moment in human history, a point that you also agree with. During this time, what was Kennedy's mood? What was his demeanor? He had the fate of the world in his hands.
He and Khrushchev did. And yes, during those 13 days, he recognized how dangerous it was. He recognized that if we offered the wrong response, if our response were too weak and we simply did nothing about the Soviet Union for the first time moving nuclear weapons outside its borders and moving them into the Western Hemisphere, only 90 miles away from our shore. If we did nothing at all, how could the alliance hold together? Because the alliance was based upon European belief, trust that America would risk its cities to save their cities. And so, on the other hand, if our response was too strong, too violent, too belligerent, we knew that the Soviet Union could fire those missiles, and we knew enough about those missiles and other Soviet weapons to know that they had the power to start a nuclear holocaust that could in time destroy the world. So, yes, it was the most difficult, tense time for Kennedy's decisions, and he didn't leap into those decisions, and at the same time, he was still able to maintain that wonderful sense of humor. For example, I tell in the book how on the penultimate day of the crisis, Saturday afternoon, October 27th, amazing how I remember what day of the week, every day that week. On October 27th, when the Soviet ships were starting again toward our naval quarantine barricade, and Soviet surface-to-air missiles had shot down our U-2 reconnaissance plane, and the military had extracted from us a promise that if they ever shot down a reconnaissance plane, we would bomb the Soviet missile site that did it. And the CIA briefing at the beginning of our XCOM, as we called it, session, had begun with a briefing that the 15, whatever they were, missile sites were now completed, ready for firing. It was just one piece of bad news after another, and we were struggling with how to respond to two contrasting letters that Khrushchev had sent. In the middle of all of that, word comes in that a U.S. fighter plane, based, I believe, in Alaska, had gone out on a mission to sample the air to find out whether the Soviets were testing their nuclear weapons. Truth of the matter is, we were testing our nuclear weapons. And this pilot, his navigational controls had been lost, and he flew out over Soviet Siberia. At that moment, on the very urge of World War, a U.S. fighter plane flies over Soviet territory. Everybody sat in stunned silence around that table. And Kennedy broke the silence saying, "There's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the word."
Ted, you drafted perhaps the most important communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev. At the same time, you were drafting alternate replies, and one of them made you were so upset you got sick.
No.
You didn't throw up you went to the You got sick, you got emotionally very upset about one reply?
You've been seeing too many movies, right? I never drafted that other response. I did draft early in the week of the first week when Bobby Kennedy rightfully said that for us to bomb the Soviet missile sites, thereby undoubtedly killing a lot of innocent Cuban civilians who were workers in the area, would be Pearl Harbor in reverse. And so we ought to therefore give some kind of notice so the civilians could clear out. The Air Force is a little skeptical about sending notice to their targets. But I was asked to draft a statement that the president would make, or a letter to Khrushchev, in which he was notified that unless X, Y, and Z, the dismantling, the withdrawal of the missiles took place, that the United States would begin bombing. And that was not only difficult to draft because I did not want to precipitate a nuclear exchange, but in addition to that, every member of the ExComm had his own condition he wanted me to attach to that. Don't make it too complicated because Khrushchev will negotiate it for days and weeks and they'll finish the missile sites. Don't make it sound like an ultimatum because superpowers don't yield to ultimata. Don't do this, don't do that, and there was no way I could draft that message that met all those conditions, and I so reported. And my failure to have a successful, feasible message to Khrushchev caused people to back away from the airstrike, which also had invasion along with it, the airstrike invasion option, and gravitate instead toward the blockade, or what we called quarantine on offensive weapons option, which is the one that Kennedy ultimately
Our
adopted.
military wanted to bomb Cuba,
Yes,
and Kennedy refused to go along?
yes. Interestingly enough, at the end of that first week, when we were pretty much gravitating toward the more restrained, more cautious option of the quarantine, the military demanded a meeting with Kennedy, and I was not, for understandable reasons, asked to attend that meeting, and did not know of its contents until a wonderful book by Ernie May and Zelikow called The White House Tapes came out and had the tapes of that meeting in which Kennedy stood up to Curtis LeMay and the other bombers and the Joint Chiefs and told them he had broader responsibilities and he had to consider what the Soviets might do to Berlin, where they clearly had a military advantage. Anyway, I did not realize just how strong and determined and cool he was till I read that transcript many, many years later. But it so happened that that morning, that was Friday morning, at the end of the first week, I was walking along the corridor of the Oval Office, and Kennedy came out of his meeting with the chiefs, and he was clearly hot. And he said to me, "Listen, you and Bobby have got to pull this thing together. In there, they want us to start the war." Well, he said that to me, I think, knowing that I was not in favor of a policy that was going to start the war. And ultimately, I put together, with more rewrites than any speech I ever wrote in my life, I put together his report to the country and, in effect, to the world on the evening of Monday, October 22nd, which laid out the option we were going to pursue, which was the blockade or quarantine.
Did Lyndon Johnson support the bombing of Cuba, support the military?
There's a story I tell, I believe, in the book, which had not been told before. And that is on that same Saturday evening, October 27, after, with Bobby's steely gaze over my shoulder, drafted the letter to Khrushchev that you mentioned, we had another meeting of the ExComm, and Vice President Johnson, who had not taken part in most of our meetings during either the first week when we formulated our response or the second week when we implemented it, Vice President Johnson was there. And by that time, the hawks in our group, and some of them were still hawks, were rising. They were saying, we told you so. We told you the quarantine wouldn't work. The only thing you can do is bomb. The only thing you can do is attack, invade. As one of them said, go in there and take Cuba away from Castro. And it was an unpleasant meeting. The president, interestingly enough, was not present at that time. He was back in his office, and I later found out that he was trying to use some backdoor channels to see if the message that had been contained in the letter to Khrushchev could be sent to Khrushchev by Secretary General U Tant, just in case Khrushchev rejected it coming from us. Anyway, Lyndon Johnson, again, I can see it very clearly, big man, slapped his big hand on the table. Well, I don't know, he said. All I know is that when you walked through a dirt road in Texas and a snake, a rattlesnake, raised up, the only thing to do was take a big stick and chop off its head. Yes, I think he favored bombing.
Now, let's get into 4 intriguing areas, a little sampler of your book. There's much more in the book. The first is Kennedy's health. The president had 2 serious health problems, his bad back and an adrenal deficiency, Addison's disease. Recently, you were one of those who authorized the release of President Kennedy's medical records. Okay? And we learned more about this. Now, how serious were his ailments, and did it affect his work?
Bad back is serious only when you have one, and I've had one. He couldn't pick up his children. He gave up really trying to play much golf, and certainly gave up tennis and touch football. But it never interfered with his work. He didn't conceal it as much as Bob Dallek, a wonderful historian, and I authorized the release of those records only to a man whom I thought would treat them responsibly, and I think he did. Because there were even occasional photographs of Kennedy on crutches, which he hated. But he didn't keep it a secret because, given the limitations and his use of the rocking chair in the Oval Office, people knew he had a bad back. But the other disease, you gave 2 names for it, adrenal insufficiency and Addison's disease. Now there lies an interesting political history. At the convention in 1960, some parallels to 2008, because the young senator with a demographic problem, Kennedy, somewhat similar to Obama, who is black, but whose charisma, good looks, and inspirational speaking and appeals to young people had enabled him to get into the position of having more delegates at that convention than anyone else. Also emerging from a multi-talented field, and there were giants in that field, Hubert Humphrey, Adlai Stevenson, Stuart Symington, and Lyndon Johnson, who was the other person who challenged Kennedy most directly at the convention and received the second highest number of votes. I'm glad to say Kennedy won on the first ballot. I think Obama probably has to win on the first ballot if he's going to win. In any event, Johnson's two closest advisors held a press conference, which he said he had nothing to do with whatsoever, in which they said Kennedy has Addison's disease, and that's going to shorten his lifespan, and he's really a very sick man, et cetera, et cetera. That, I might add, was on top of stories that he had spread that Kennedy's father was anti-Semitic and pro-Hitler and lots of other untrue things. In any event, we held an emergency meeting with Kennedy's doctors, and they agreed that the words adrenal insufficiency were equally accurate as Addison's disease, because classic Addison's disease had certain symptoms that Kennedy did not have. So we had to decide which to use, and as I put it, suppose you were courting a young lady, and in a way, running for the presidency is like courting somebody. Which would you use? Would you tell her that you had an adrenal insufficiency or Addison's disease? Clearly, nobody wanted to. Kennedy didn't, and Bobby did not want to say he had Addison's disease, which sounds horrible. And so Bobby held a response press statement saying, yes, he does have an adrenal insufficiency controlled by medication, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't a complete cover-up, but maybe it wasn't the full facts.
So there was some concealment in it. Now, you're somebody who believes strongly in open government and transparency. How do you justify this?
I just did.
Would you accept it if any one of our presidential candidates today did the same thing?
Don't tempt me, Ralph. I think I'm very glad Mrs. Clinton got away from those snipers.
Now, you have a chapter on Kennedy's personal life, and this is the first time you've discussed this, as you've done in your book. And you are critical of some of these indiscretions, but you said you knew nothing of them. You have a very nice line. You were his friend, his counselor, but you were not his drinking buddy. Did any of these
or other activities?
Did any of these indiscretions affect his work?
Not in the slightest. First of all, unlike some other presidents, to the best of my knowledge, none of them took place in the Oval Office. And I might add that he worked a very long day. Frequently, he came over to the Oval Office after dinner at night. I would still be in my office, and we would work late into the night. He was a very hard-working president. And on the single biggest accomplishments of his tragically abbreviated years, which include the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis without firing a shot, which include turning the country around on civil rights after centuries of discrimination and segregation against blacks, which include his decision to galvanize our space program, which had been mostly failures up to that point, by aiming for a lunar landing, and the Peace Corps, and the programs on mental health and mental retardation, and the aid to higher education, and so on through a long list. I can't think of one of those that in any way was cut short or downgraded as a result of his personal life.
Why did President Kennedy and the Attorney General Robert Kennedy not fire J. Edgar Hoover, whom they disliked very much?
Well, I don't think Robert Kennedy, as a very supportive Attorney General, felt that it was his place to fire J. Edgar Hoover, even though they didn't get along very well. And some very sound political scientists, the late Dick Neustadt, who surely has graced this hall in the past, thought that it was good public policy to make the director of the FBI and the director of the CIA permanent career servants, so that a change of party in the White House did not mean a change in those nonpartisan security agencies. And consistent with that, I have a feeling J.F.K's father weighed in and said that Hoover ought to be kept. And as Kennedy himself remarked to someone, you don't fire God.
Now, to get to another painful topic, the assassination, which is a devastating and shattering thing for you. Poll after poll in the intervening years have shown that the majority of the American public believed that there was a larger conspiracy behind this. They still do, and that Oswald didn't act alone. Do you have similar suspicions?
Well, that's a difficult question for many reasons. On the one hand, I understand why many people, not only in this country but around the world, including me, shudder to think that Kennedy did not die for a cause, did not die a martyr, but just died a senseless death because a somewhat lunatic but clearly skilled sharpshooter was able to penetrate his skull. That's everybody would feel better if there were proof that the far right or the communists or the mafia or the Russians, the Cubans, that there had been some grand conspiracy. But there is no proof. And however people may criticize the effort of the Warren Commission report, they were a group of very, very able and distinguished citizens with a terrific staff. So I have not read any of these conspiracy theories over the years. It's impossible to rule out some of those that I listed because they had motive. There were even military people, as a book last year pointed out, who became alarmed at Kennedy's American University speech and had his talk about drawing down the number of military advisors and instructors we had in Vietnam. Yes, lots of people had motive, and no doubt some of them had lots of access to weapons and to conspiratorial and secret clandestine means, but that doesn't prove that any of them did it. And I suppose just as there were conspiracy theories alive for at least 40 years after the death of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, I suppose those conspiracy theories will continue to be the subject of speculation, and I talk about them a little bit in my book, but I don't endorse or embrace any one of them.
Ted, you didn't have much confidence in Lyndon Johnson when he was vice president, and certainly Jackie Kennedy seems to have disliked him intensely, as your book indicates. Now, what was the reason for that? Was Johnson obstructing the administration? Was he conspiring, or was it just a matter of difference of style and temperament?
Well, it's certainly the styles were very different. Johnson was picked in part because he was different from Kennedy. He was a Protestant. Kennedy had to worry about anti-Catholics. He was a Southwesterner, and Kennedy had to worry about those who felt he just came from one corner of the East. He had been a long time member of House and Senate, and some people challenged Kennedy on being too young, and so on. Well, he was very different, and that helped, I think, in Texas and a few other southern states in the election, but it also meant that the two men were very different even during the White House days. Kennedy made a point of inviting Johnson to all of our formal meetings, such as the Cabinet, which almost never met, the National Security Council, which almost never met, the press conference breakfast. Kennedy had press conferences every 2 weeks. No president's come close to that since. And each morning we'd have breakfast and with the Secretary of State and Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, and I and others would go over all the issues that might come up, and Johnson was invited to those. And also every week, I think every week, or maybe every two, we had breakfast with the legislative leaders, both the House and the Senate, and Johnson was invited to those breakfasts as well. Now, the truth of the matter is that most of the decisions were made not at those formal meetings, but at informal gatherings in which Kennedy had around the table the handful, he didn't like big meetings, the handful of cabinet members and other advisors whose recommendations that he wanted. And when Johnson was present at those, the president would almost always say to him, "What do you think, Mr. Vice President?" And the vice president would invariably reply, "Well, I don't know enough about that subject to comment." Not because he was modest. Lyndon Johnson was not a modest man. That was his little way of saying, "Your people haven't briefed me and kept me fully informed." And Kennedy resented that. But the truth of the matter is, when I wrote my first big book and I asked Jackie to look at the manuscript to see if she had any comments, corrections, and so on, I was astonished at her handwritten notes asking me to change a variety of favorable references to Johnson. And I think historians may find that one of the most interesting revelations in my book, how little she thought of LBJ, and, according to her, how little J.F.K. thought of LBJ. And at the time that she gave me those notes, my book was not yet in my first book was not yet in final galleys, but LBJ was president of the United States, and Bobby still had political ambitions of his own, and I just felt that it would violate her confidence if I put them in the book at that point. So now you and everyone else has a chance to get a little Schadenfreude reading them now.
Ted, in terms of American history, the Kennedy administration was a short presidency. Why do you think it made such an impact on the country? And what do you think Kennedy's historical legacy will be?
Oh, I think that decades from now, maybe even centuries from now, historians will look back at the 20th century. They will say it was the most violent century up to that time in the history of mankind. And two superpowers, two huge blocs, had weapons capable of destroying the earth itself, but in the one potential confrontation, the Cuban Missile Crisis, they did not unleash those terrible weapons, largely because we had, as President of the United States, a very cool, detached, cool man who had gone through war and did not want another one. I think they will also say that the middle of the 20th century was a turning point for the moral position of the United States. Once the President of the United States on nationwide television told the country that these centuries of discrimination and segregation based on race had to end. I think they may also say that it was in the middle of the 20th century when man first freed himself from the tethers of Earth through a space program that had been galvanized by Kennedy's moonshot program. I think they will reflect, as a distinguished British author did a year or two ago, how remarkable it was that here was a president of the United States who had at his disposal the most powerful military force ever known to man, but chose not to use it. At least he'd use it only for deterrent purposes, but never to attack or invade someone else. So I think not only did Kennedy break down the religious barriers to the White House, not only was he the youngest president ever elected, but I think the spirit that he brought to the presidency and to his campaign will be remembered, and there will be people trying to imitate it for a long time to come.
Was Kennedy's charisma, his political aura, unique to him? So many of his associates, you yourself included, sought public office and didn't succeed.
Well, of course, his charisma was, not only his charisma, but his political genius was unique to him. A lot of us around him, and me and Kenny O'Donnell and Pierre Salinger, Sarge Shriver, others, all felt, gee, there's nothing to it. We could run for office and win. Well, we found that there was a lot to it, and none of us had the political talent that J.F.K. did.
Now, you've been saying on many occasions that Senator Obama reminds you of Kennedy.
Yes.
If Kennedy's qualities were unique to him, you're saying that Obama reminds you of him, has no political value.
No, on the contrary, I think that Obama's appeal to the young, I can't tell you how heartened I have been to go into 6, 7, 8 states to speak for Obama and find that in each of those states, it's a group of young, very talented, not vastly experienced, but dedicated idealists who are there working to put Obama across. And that's the big distinction between the Obama campaign and these professional campaign consultants who have been publicly fighting with each other in Hillary's campaign, because since the Bobby Kennedy campaign, there has not been that kind of inspiration and interest among the young. And they've been very cynical. They've been disillusioned by one president after another, and they had a lot to be disillusioned about. So Obama, who had to overcome, as I mentioned earlier, the demographic obstacle, just as Kennedy had to overcome his religion, and Obama, who was young and charged with inexperience, just as Kennedy was. Obama, who learned a lot about foreign policy by viewing the United States from abroad, just as Kennedy did as an ambassador's son. So I think in many of those ways, Obama is more like John F. Kennedy than any candidate since Robert Kennedy.
Now, speaking as a very committed Democrat all your life, from your own perspective, may not be totally objective, but
True.
Many people are interested in this. How will history evaluate the second Bush administration?
I think I've, as you know, lived a long time and clearly it's the worst administration in my lifetime. I don't know that much about James Buchanan, but I do like to tell a true story about James Buchanan that I think applies totally. Buchanan was in the White House fiddling while the country burned, so to speak. The country was about to slide into a civil war, and Buchanan was doing nothing about it, despite the fact that he had had brilliant experience. He had held all the big jobs. Anyway, on the Senate floor, as civil war loomed, the Senate was debating, what do we do if Washington is invaded? What do we do if Congress can't meet? Or what do we do if something happens to the executive branch and so on? And Senator Sherman of Ohio rose and said, the Constitution of the United States already provides for every contingency except a vacancy in the mind of the president.
Now, you say Obama reminds you of Kennedy and so on, but Kennedy had a certain toughness. His judgment was very good. For a young man, he was very wise. Obama says judgment is more important than experience. You can make a case each way. But the recent handling of some situations by Obama has disappointed many people. And if you can't handle your campaign problems very well or cause them, can you be entrusted with the presidency?
When you ask about can't handle your family very well, which candidate are you talking about?
I'm talking about your candidate, Obama, Reverend Wright.
Oh, I thought the other candidate was the one who couldn't handle her family very well.
That's a separate issue.
Anyway, no, you're right. Kennedy had a certain toughness. What nobody really knows is how tough he was. There were several states where favorite sons, usually governors, were planning on running for president. Their chance to have at least 15 minutes of television fame at the convention or otherwise. Well, John F. Kennedy, as I mentioned earlier tonight, had to win on the first ballot. He didn't want those favorite sons draining away votes that he needed to get on the first ballot. And he went to pay a friendly visit on many of those governors. And in the course of a friendly chat, he said, I hope you're not going to run as a favorite son in your state, because if you do, I'm going to come in, and here in my pocket is a poll in your state which shows I will beat you in your own state. Oh, we'll support you, Mr. Kennedy. And so all those states ultimately ended up in the Kennedy column. Yes, he could be tough, but he didn't leave the Catholic Church because of quotations taken out of context from a variety of popes and priests, prelates from other centuries, other countries, which were just as relevant as the quotations that have been taken out of context from the Reverend Wright, whom I'm not defending, but Kennedy said in his Houston speech to the Houston Protestant Ministers Association, Kennedy referred to those quotations of extremists from Catholics, and he said, I do not regard myself as bound by those statements. Why should you? I don't think anyone with an ounce of fairness regards Obama as bound by those loony statements made by the Reverend Wright, who's like a lot of people we know who in politics as well as the pulpit who like the sound of their own voices.
You know the Clintons well. On occasion you have said that President Clinton was a good president.
When?
quite some time ago, okay, but he wasn't a bad president. Why do you think that Obama is a better Democratic candidate than Hillary Clinton?
To sum it up in one sentence or two, I want to be certain. You have I already conveyed my feeling about these 8 terrible years our country has gone through, 7.5 now. I want to be absolutely certain that we not only change the person in the White House and the party in the White House, but also the policy in the White House. If Obama is the next president, I am certain that the policy will change. I'm not that certain with anyone else.
How seriously do you think the president's struggle for the Democratic nomination will damage the Democratic Party?
Memories are short, and people forget that we've had struggles for the Democratic nomination time after time. The Democrats are not as disciplined a party as the Republicans are, and they're a more passionate party. So we've had divisions in the past. Think about the bitter divisions against Kennedy because of his religion and his youth. Terrible divisions when Robert Kennedy was called all those names during his candidacy. But I'm confident that the Democratic Party has discovered someone who's going to unite them. His name is John McCain. John McCain has made it clear that he wants 4 more years of the Bush war in Iraq, if not 100 more, that he wants 4 more years of the Bush tax cuts, which have given us the single greatest national debt to burden our grandchildren of all time, 4 more years of a flawed economic policy which has created the greatest divide between rich and poor in this country's history. 4 more years. I can't see any Clinton supporter in the primaries or Obama supporter in the primaries supporting McCain, and they will unite behind the Democratic nominee.
It's not that they will support McCain, they may just sit on their hands.
Not if they think that will endanger their nominee.
Are you satisfied with the way that Obama has conducted his campaign?
If I had some contrary advice to give him, I think I would give it to him in private, not before this wonderful audience. But frankly, I would have responded sooner to the controversy, the furor, and all those savage video clips regarding the Reverend Wright. Other than that, I think his campaign has been brilliant because he's focused on the delegates. I can't tell you how many times Kennedy and I would be out there at the grassroots level. And Lyndon Johnson would announce, I'm talking about during the 60 campaign, early part of the 60 campaign, Lyndon Johnson would announce that Senator so-and-so had just endorsed him, and therefore he was claiming that state. Well, we knew 2 things. A, senators don't control convention delegations, and B, it's out there at the grassroots where Kennedy was, where the local mayors and county chairmen and legislators, state chairmen, they're the delegates and they control the delegates. And Obama has brilliantly focused on the delegates, and like Kennedy, Obama has been very good in states which have caucuses, which are the people who are active and participate on a regular basis in the party. And Obama knows how to negotiate, knows how to appeal to those party leaders. You know what? That's what a president has to do on a worldwide basis.
Why has Bill Clinton been less effective than one would have expected?
You'll have to ask Bill Clinton.
He may not even know, but what is your view of that?
I don't know, frankly. I've been very disappointed. I've known Bill and Hillary Clinton since 1984 when I met them at the San Francisco Democratic Convention. They're both very smart. They're both very nice. I think Bill Clinton is so persuasive and articulate a communicator that if he were sitting up here with us right now, he'd persuade me I'm wrong. But I think he is very anxious to remain the #1 Democrat in the country. He's very anxious to go back into the White House, which A, is where I don't want him, and B, is why I would advise Obama not to take the vice presidency on the Hillary ticket, because at best he'd be #3 in the White House.
Would you be for Obama offering Hillary a vice president?
That's a tougher, closer question, because after all, LBJ had said those terrible things about Kennedy and his father, but LBJ clearly brought to the national ticket all of the criteria that a presidential nominee should consider, but not until the last possible minute. You should consider, after you're the nominee, what's the state of the party? Where are you weak? Where are you strong? Where are the gaps? Racially, regionally, religiously, politically, or otherwise. You don't know that till the last minute. But you also want someone who will be congenial and compatible in terms of the platform, which is usually fashioned in a way that the presidential nominee wants. And you want someone who would have all the qualities of judgment and stability to become a successful president if something ever happens to you as president. And I'm not sure anyone who supported the single biggest foreign policy mistake this country's ever made, which is the invasion of Iraq, and now talks about obliterating Iran, would meet any of those criteria.
Ted, a couple of final questions. What do you think an American president can do to rebuild America's position in the world?
It's going to take a much longer time than any of us realize. I don't think we have, well, you do because you travel around the world. I don't think we have any idea how much damage has been done to this country's moral authority, has been done to the American values that J.F.K. so proudly communicated to the world, not only on his speeches abroad, but on his speeches here at home. And we have no idea how we are now distrusted and feared because of 7.5 years in which our foreign policy was primarily based on our military might. They're even talking about the militarization of outer space, which John F. Kennedy had pledged must remain a peaceful sphere. And so I think that during his first year in office, the new president must go to the United Nations General Assembly in September and make a strong and specific pledge that that chapter in American history and foreign policy is over, that the United States is going to become once again a champion of international law and international organizations, that the United States is going to be, as it was in Kennedy's day, a country that cares about other countries, especially those who are in, well, I can even quote a few lines out of the inaugural address, those who live in the huts and villages of mass misery across the globe. It's going to once again have a diplomacy in which other countries will be heard, will be listened to. One speech won't do it, but enough facts, enough actions demonstrating that it's a new chapter in American foreign policy will, over time, I hope, restore respect for America and its values, and thereby make this a much safer country.
When that speech is given, I hope you will draft it. Finally, you've gone through terrible times, good times and very bad times. You've seen the American position go through bad times. What keeps your optimism and faith in America? Is America going to be like Britain, its terminal decline as a great power? Is it going to vanish like the Soviet Union? What makes you hope that the United States can come back and...
That's a profound and difficult question, Ralph. I've always been an optimist, in part because my parents were, despite some difficulties that they faced in life, certainly in part because John F. Kennedy was, although when you consider the bad back and other illnesses, he nevertheless set out against insurmountable odds as a Roman Catholic, still in his 30s when he first started his exploration of the presidency. So yes, he was an optimist, and that optimism proved to be valid. And finally, despite the 2004 presidential election, when they re-elected this dunce, I still have confidence in the American people. They are good people. It sometimes takes them a little time to see the light, but there's an innate wisdom there, and I think they are a generous people, as they demonstrated time and time again, particularly after World War II, and I think that goodness and that generosity will, in the end, prevail.
We have some time for questions. Now, can you raise up the lights, please? Now, some of you will leave before the end of the program. There are books outside if you leave early, but if you want your books to be signed by Mr. Sorensen, after the program is over, he will sign them for you, okay? Let me just put in one plug for these books. This is a book that is really 5 books. It's a life story. We've heard a little bit about it. There's much more in the book. It's a history of our times. It's a philosophic work in that there are ideas and provocative thoughts. And it's a handbook on how to handle personal and national tragedy and disappointments and still remain hopeful about America.
Oh, you left out 2. I'm going to ask the New York Times to put it on the how-to list, because there's one memo in there on how to write a speech, and there's another one in there on how to run for president.
That's right. I hope that candidates read that. Present candidates read the one on how to be president. But the right candidates. We have time for some questions. Yes?
I have 2 questions. One is...
One at a time.
Who was responsible for the Peace Corps concept?
Who was responsible for the Peace Corps concept?
I say in the book that John F. Kennedy often illustrated his ideas and his points by invoking ancient Chinese proverbs. Most of them my Chinese friends never heard of. I even, 5 years ago, Ralph, do you remember? I asked you about I wanted to thank some people who had been so kind to me after my stroke, and I was going to quote an old Asian proverb, only in the winter can you tell which trees are evergreen. I thought that was apt, You said you'd never heard of it, and that instead you thought I should invoke another Asian proverb, only when the tide is out can you tell who's been swimming without a bathing suit. Anyway, this is a long way. Kennedy invoked a supposed Chinese proverb, failure is an orphan, but success has 100 fathers.
Yes, sir.
Peace Corps was a success, and it rightfully had 100 fathers. Kennedy often talked about the example of the Mormon Church sending out young college graduates to be missionaries who lived and worked with the people. He talked frankly about the fact that the Cubans were doing a better job of sending doctors and engineers to developing countries than we were. There were also bills that had been introduced along these lines by Hubert Humphrey. There was a businessman who later became governor of Pennsylvania, who nobody's ever heard of, named Milton Shapp, who had a similar proposal. General Gavin, who became our ambassador in Paris, had a similar idea. I put them all together once after Kennedy made a totally spontaneous address very, very late at night on the steps of the University of Michigan Student Union, and that combined package went into a speech he made on peace. Don't hear very many presidential candidates make speeches on peace anymore. In San Francisco, I believe just exactly 1 week before the election and after the election, we had a task force to staff it out, figure out the more controversial questions.
A couple times you mentioned positive things that Johnson brought to the ticket, but what's your view about people say that he was only offered that position as a courtesy, and the Kennedys were dismayed that he accepted in Illinois, that they overheard Bobby try to talk him out of accepting?
Was the vice president offered to Lyndon Johnson as a courtesy in the expectation that he would refuse?
I think there may have been some surprise that he accepted, but I don't believe it was offered just as a courtesy. I do talk about this some in the book, and I point out that in the Kennedy Library you can find my memo to JFK. It might have even been jointly to JFK and RFK, in which I talk about possible vice presidential candidates, and I point out that Johnson, for all the reasons I mentioned, where he doesn't have Kennedy's problems, religion, location, age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in many ways, Johnson was a very logical choice for Kennedy, and when Bobby found the reaction of labor and liberals was bitterly negative and told that to JFK, JFK in his casual, informal way may have said, well, why don't you go talk to Lyndon? This isn't written in stone yet. And when Bobby talked to Lyndon, Lyndon got very angry and thought that Bobby was trying, whom he didn't like anyway, was trying to talk him off the ticket.
Yes, sir.
I realize this question is hugely speculative, but indulge us. You knew and worked with John Kennedy and you knew Bobby. How would you compare the presidency of John Kennedy to what might have been a Robert Kennedy presidency?
That's a highly speculative question, but it is answered in the book. I think that John Kennedy was more intellectual, in some ways more steeped in American history and in international affairs and culture than Bobby. On the other hand, Bobby was more both passionate and compassionate, and I think would have done everything he could to promptly stop the presence of American military advisors and instructors in Vietnam, and push hard not only on civil rights legislation, but on changing the civil rights atmosphere in this
Back
country.
there. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was just wondering, you were talking
You're talking about John F. Kennedy's book, Why England Slept.
No, John F. Kennedy wrote the book Why England Slept, not his father. Yeah.
Yes, that's by John F. Kennedy.
Yeah. I think we can move on, yes.
I'm just amazed at the extraordinary oratorical skills of Kennedy. In retrospect, he was an extraordinary public speaker. I want to know who wrote his speeches. When he had to write a speech, when a speech had to be given, did somebody write it? Did he delegate it to somebody, and then he edited it? Did you contribute percentage, or was it O'Donnell? Who actually wrote these speeches? They were extraordinary speeches.
Well, you have the person seated here. To what extent did he edit? To what extent did he edit your drafts?
That's nice of my cousin to raise that question. He, let me just say that during the years I worked for him when he was United States Senator, and I would occasionally be on the Senate floor to hand him papers or whatever, I would see United States senators, some of them great heroes and champions, stand up and read a speech that they clearly had never read before in their life. John Kennedy never did that. And yes, he would edit. We would disagree occasionally on words, sentences, paragraphs. Occasionally he would delete a paragraph. Occasionally I would try to sneak it back in a few speeches later.
Practice the speeches before he gave them?
Never, never.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask this question. Did you give him the line,
Ik ben een burner.
Oh, I thought he was going to have about ask not. I'm happy to say I forget. Willy Brandt, later a great chancellor, but at the time the mayor of West Berlin, in his memoirs said that he and I had dinner the night before, and I rehearsed that line with him and asked him about the correct pronunciation. I really have no recollection of having any such dinner with Willy Brandt, whom I admired greatly. But if I had, he would have told me to change the wording so it didn't mean I am a breakfast roll.
Over here, yes. Over here, lady over here. Yes. You have a question? Oh. Let's go back a little bit. Yes, sir. It's very much in the book. Yes.
Not only have I mentioned it several times tonight, but I devote a substantial part of the book to talking about what Kennedy would have done had he lived, had he been elected, as I believe he would have been, to a second term. And Vietnam, I said, was the single greatest issue in foreign affairs that faced him, and I believe he would have sought, if it could be found, a counterpart to reach a negotiated end to the conflict in Vietnam.
Over here.
What would have been the history had Kennedy not been assassinated? Can you visualize it?
What would have happened if Kennedy was not assassinated? What sort of America would have been produced?
Oh, I think it would be it would have been a different world then, it would be a different world today. With all due respect to Lyndon Johnson, he was no John F. Kennedy. He did a wonderful job of following through on civil rights legislation as only he could, but in terms of the kind of hope that Kennedy elicited when he was in the White House, in our inner cities, that somebody in the White House was listening, somebody in the White House cared. I don't believe the riots, which were devastating after Martin Luther King's death in 1968, I don't believe they would have occurred had Kennedy been in the White House. I don't believe the riots on our college campuses would have occurred because young people felt Kennedy cared and was listening. I know we would not have had the escalation in Vietnam, in which we ultimately sent over 500,000 combat troops to Vietnam, when Kennedy, at the time that the number of instructors and advisors grew to 16,000, announced with McNamara that he wanted at least 1,000 of them out by the end of that year. So the country would not have suffered the inflation that was brought about as a result of Johnson's determination to have both guns and butter, to have an expensive Great Society program, at the same time fighting a full-scale war. I like to think that détente with the Soviet Union, which had its beginnings not only in Kennedy's American University commencement address, but in the negotiation a month thereafter as a result of the limited test ban treaty, the first step toward arms control in the nuclear age. I like to think that détente between East and West, and that probably would have required Khrushchev staying in power, because he was forced out in part by the hardliners in his own circle who felt he should never have given in to the Kennedy quarantine during the missile crisis and all the rest. So I think in many ways it would have been a very different world.
Ma'am?
Many people are concerned about the situation in Michigan and in Florida. How would you feel that this could be resolved in the best interest of the American people?
How would you resolve the Michigan-Florida situation?
So it happens that a couple of weeks ago I was at a dinner where the Democratic National Chairman, who's partly to blame for his Rules Committee decreeing that those who rushed to the front of the line and broke the party's rules, Michigan and Florida specifically, would be denied seats at the convention if they went ahead and held primaries anyway. They did go ahead and hold primaries anyway. Obama didn't compete in them because there had been an agreement with all the candidates that they would not honor this or pay attention to this breach of the National Committee rules. So at the dinner with Howard Dean, the chairman, I offered for his consideration what I did, and this I'm sorry to say I did not remember to put in the book, which is too long to have anything added to it. What I did at the 1960 convention about Puerto Rico. Now, as I've mentioned twice already, Kennedy had to win on the first ballot because his name would not have emerged from a back room, a deal. And therefore, we needed every vote we could get on that first ballot. And he got the majority, and it was alphabetical roll call. We got the majority in the very last state called Wyoming. But people don't know that Puerto Rico would have been called after Wyoming. And in Puerto Rico, we had a credentials fight. A couple of very, very distinguished American lawyers, part of the Democratic Party establishment and big Lyndon Johnson supporters and friends, had convinced the George Washington of Puerto Rico, Luis Munoz Marin, that Puerto Rico should support Johnson at the convention. But Kennedy, once again working at that grassroots level, he and I had gone down there in 1958 and worked with a rather, shall we say, lively character named Pepe Benitez, who was the chairman of the state Democratic Party. Nobody had ever heard of him. But both Munoz Marin and Benitez brought delegations to Los Angeles demanding to be seated. Well, inasmuch as the Kennedy forces were in a majority of the convention and had control of the Credentials Committee, I was sent to try to negotiate a compromise, and I did. It had two parts, and I recommend this to Howard Dean. Part one, both delegations would be seated, each one with half a vote. Part two, all of them would be committed to Kennedy. I recommend it to Obama.
Yes, sir.
My question is an observation and a question. How is it over the years from Gene Kirkpatrick to Dick Cheney, the American discourse as far as politics is concerned, has the neocons have taken over this policy in Washington, and they've done it by cornering the market on God and country. When is the
God and who?
In the country, God and country.
Oh, God and country.
they put the flag? They put
Yeah.
They say what the last bastion of a scholar
Oh, yeah.
flag.
Yeah. What's the question?
But the point I'm saying to you is this: when is the left or the liberal side of the agenda, especially from the Democratic Party, going to come out and do battle to take back that ground that they've given up for at least 30 years?
Okay.
Very, very good question.
The question is, when will the center or the liberal part, the Democratic Party, take back public discourse from the neocons
Frankly, I've been
who've erected
I've
God
been,
and country?
I've been disappointed by the lack of courage as well as action by the Democratic Party for some time now. When I was a young man working for Senator John F. Kennedy, the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate was Robert Taft of Ohio. And he said the duty of the opposition is to oppose. Well, I agree with that, and the Democrats haven't done a very good job of opposing for several reasons. One is they've been raising money from the same arms makers and oil companies and others that favor a more belligerent foreign policy. Another reason is that the Republican strategists, as you say, seized the flag, even insisting on wearing flag lapels. John F. Kennedy was a war hero, but he never wore a flag in his lapel. But they seized that issue and said the Democrats were soft on national security. And so now we've seen a succession of Democratic leaders, office holders, presidential candidates and otherwise, who are trying to show that they're not soft on security by going to the opposite extreme and taking hard-line, bellicose positions on security. Please, let's not have any more. I mean, we have George W. Bush, who, because so much publicity exposed his avoiding military service, was apparently determined from his first year onward to show that he could be militarily tough. I don't want another president who thinks she has to prove she's militarily tough.
Okay, last question. Yes.
How, if at all, did Adlai Stevenson's conduct during the 60 convention affect his chances of being named Secretary of State?
Quite a bit. Adlai kept telling J.F.K. during that entire year that he was really for him, but he couldn't disappoint the people who wanted him to run, and he couldn't make up his mind what to do. And when he arrived at the convention, he still didn't know what to do. And I report an absolutely true, previously unpublished anecdote in my book that one of his own advisors,
One of Stevenson's own advisors said to him, "Governor, you're not going to be a candidate because there isn't anybody here who will put your name in nomination." He said, "Well, that can't be," and he immediately called people on the Illinois delegation, and he put the phone down, turned around, and said, "You're right. They're all for Kennedy. What will Eleanor say?" That didn't sound like a
strong, decisive Secretary of State to Kennedy.
Now, we have come to the end of, I think, an extraordinary evening. I urge you to beg, borrow, steal, or preferably buy the book. And this is what Senator Obama has said about the book. It is a book that will be cherished for generations. We must thank Ted Sorensen for being with us today, and hope you'll come back again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. Thank you. Thank you.